Okay, welcome to NCHE's virtual conference breakout session, exploring one enslaved woman's power through scaffolded digital storytelling. The NCHE would, actually just a sec here, there we go. The NCHE would like to recognize the support of the sponsors which have made this virtual conference possible. Thanks also to the National Humanities Center for its partnership in this virtual conference and GoToWebinar for licensing support. The NCHE has a wide catalog of online and in-person opportunities for scholars and educators to collaborate. Please visit their website. It's shown there on the slide. We encourage you to download the conference app, which has the most up-to-date information on the conference. And please take time to visit the virtual exhibit hall. You will find wonderful opportunities there for resources and connections. My name is Josh Reed. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Washington. I am jointly appointed in the History and American Indian Studies departments. I am also the John Calhoun Smith Endowed Professor of History, and I direct our Center for the Studies of the Pacific Northwest. I'm a registered member of the Snohomish Indian Tribe, a tribal nation here in the greater Puget Sound region. And before I kind of began this career as a professor, before I went back to graduate school, I taught middle school for 9 years, plenty of social studies and language arts types of classes there. I will be moderating this session. You may use the chat function to type your questions or comments during the session. Throughout the presentation, I will interject at an appropriate time to ask questions. The presenters have structured their presentation such that there may be times when they ask you to reply to a question that they pose. Again, use the chat function. And if something goes awry on your end, that we're trying to show, or sound kicks out or something like that, please shoot us a message in chat, and hopefully I will be able to see that and can troubleshoot whatever comes up. But whatever comes across through the chat function, I will I'll be the one who relays that information and speaks to the presenters. Following this session, please take a minute to complete our survey. In addition to providing valuable feedback, completing the survey puts you into a daily drawing for one of our special door prizes. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Aaron Johnson currently works in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Teacher Education at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Aaron's research interests include historical thinking and inquiry, culturally responsive teaching, technology integration, and the pedagogical spaces of overlap that link these within the context of social studies education and teacher preparation more generally. Aaron is a co-PI for the Humanities Without Walls project, the Classroom in the Future of the Historical Record, Humanities Education in a Changing Climate for Knowledge Production, and currently serves as senior personnel for the International Consortium for Multilingual Excellence in Education, a Department of Education funded project that provides professional development opportunities for teachers of multilingual learners. Grant Scribner is a doctoral student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Prior to beginning his doctoral studies, Grant taught middle school social studies in Washington, D.C. and Omaha, Nebraska. So at this point, I am going to turn things over to Aaron. Aaron, you should have control of your guys' presentation.
Thank you, Josh, so much for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for so much for being here with us. One of the things that Josh alluded to in his talk briefly there was the idea that there are chat options for you to be able to interact with us as presenters, and we do see this as an opportunity to facilitate or to have that type of engagement or that type of dialogue, so to speak. And kind of as an entry point, having said that, and as an entry point into our time together, what we would like to do, just to kind of, again, enter into our discussion about our project and more generally, and then kind of hear from you in other contexts. But we want to focus in on this idea of difficult history as kind of this larger, big idea we know that research suggests that teachers and students both commonly avoid topics or histories that are considered difficult in nature. And so with that chat option that Josh mentioned earlier, we would like to hear from you in terms of what are some of the histories or the topics that you consider difficult. And then kind of as a follow-up to that, how should teachers approach histories of this nature? So we're going to give you a couple of minutes to look at those two questions. And again, utilizing the chat feature, just generate a little list, and then we'll reconnect as soon as Josh has an opportunity to field some of your responses and feed that information to us.
So Aaron and Grant, while we're waiting for some of our attendees to send us some answers to your question, I know that one of the topics, of course, in my field that needs to be, that I find myself addressing is, kind of that issue of genocide, particularly how it applies to indigenous North America with the settler colonial expansion of the United States. So that would definitely be one of those difficult histories and topics and themes. And I guess one of the ways that I approach this when I'm thinking about how to approach it, I try to be very precise.
Sure.
I don't make sweeping claims that it was genocide everywhere all the time. Because that also, that itself is a little problematic. I think it waters it down, but it also, as a historian, I seek historical precision, knowing that that might be a futile goal in its own right. But I think it's really important to be precise sometimes when we're talking about these types of things and to avoid sweeping generalizations. That gives us better tools to analyze the past.
Yeah, I agree, and I hear you wholeheartedly on that. Being precise with regards to word choice and how we choose to make sort of differences and kind of tease out nuance, I think is really important. And you're right. I think those sweeping claims can often sort of stall any type of sort of going deeper and really understanding nuance in ways that can be, problematic or overgeneralized, which mirrors, I think, in many ways what we're going to talk about as we get into enslavement. And so I don't know. For the sake of time, I want to keep this moving, Josh. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if you've heard from anyone yet, but
I don't. Let me just check the questions in case something came out that way. Nope, I'm not seeing
okay.
anything on the chat
That's
line,
okay.
which is fine.
Sure.
So,
Totally.
guys, want to go ahead and move on forward?
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea is, when we think about difficult histories, I think if we were to kind of have a short list and kind of compare lists, so to speak, I think we would find that the topic of, at least in the context of American history or North American history, would be the idea of enslavement. I think that one stands apart as one that we all can sort of agree upon as being one of the more difficult histories, one of the more difficult periods in American history to talk about with classroom students. And before we get even further into that and talking about our project, I wanted to provide a little context too, and thinking about how kids are learning about enslavement. And so with that, the Southern Poverty Law Center put out a study, essentially a survey of 1,000 high school seniors, 1,500 high school teachers. They looked at state standards in 15 states, and they looked at textbooks of those states. And essentially what they found here is that there is a a general lack of knowledge about American enslavement in our country. And there's some of the statistics here on the slide, or at least some of the initial findings from that study that really speak to the idea that students generally have a lack of knowledge in thinking about this very important, difficult history, which has led to some particularly problematic outcomes. What they found through the course of this study was that sort of general findings from the SPLC study was that there was a heavy focus on heroes, so like Tubman, Douglas, Lincoln. Those types of figures were very much at the forefront of how enslavement is taught in schools, without an understanding that slavery was a Southern problem, without acknowledging the fact that it existed in all 13 colonies at the time of the Revolution, or that there were certain protections within the Constitution for slavery. Oops, my slides are moving ahead of me. What they found too was a heavy focus on politics and the economics, removes the humanity and harsh realities of enslavement. And what they found through the course of working with students and surveying students was that oftentimes there's a perception that slavery ended with the 13th Amendment without fully acknowledging or avoiding the long-term effects of slavery. So Jim Crow and other systems of oppression that thrived in the aftermath of the 13th Amendment and the American Civil War. There's a little lag here on my toggling through slides let's see, okay, there we go. And on a more contextualized level, and germane to our perspective in our presentation, some of the more shocking instances of how students are learning about enslavement. I wanted to give our participants just a few seconds to take this in. So with this context in mind, and getting to the Anna Project, we were drawn to works that addressed thoughtful ways of teaching about enslavement, including the works of LeGarrette King and Ashley Woodson, amongst others. Their work suggests agency with regards to the enslaved. So to what extent do we rely on primary sources in our own teaching? These are really kind of questions that kind of move me and Grant towards the working with the Anna Project, which I'll talk more specifically about in just a moment. But like also thinking about ways the enslaved are positioned within how we teach. So thinking about agency and response to oppressive conditions as opposed to consistently being in subordinate positions. Oversimplifying accounts, which is kind of speaking to what Josh had mentioned earlier. And then, do my students think slavery is something that's accidental as opposed to something that was very intentional, and a very intentional operation of human exploitation? So with these questions in mind, and kind of introducing the Anna Project. Okay, again, waiting for my slide. Oh, okay, well, forgot about this slide. This kind of crystallizes in some ways that second bullet point about like how enslavement is viewed and kind of agency versus subordination. We see these are actually two memorials in the DC area, one memorializing the Emancipation Proclamation, and the other on the right side of your screen page is one that represents the 54th Massachusetts Regiment in a much more agentic or a much more sort of active agency involved in that particular way of depicting a response to the harsh conditions, realities of the enslaved. And so with that, kind of thinking about that, this is speaking to the project of Anna. Dr. Will Thomas, who's a historian at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, as part of his work on the OSE Can You See research collaborative, which essentially is Will and his colleagues were doing research into the DC interslave trade during the early 1800s. They were looking specifically at petitions for manumission. Will came across the story of a woman who was simply known by the name of Anna, who in an act of defiance sort of leapt from the third-story window of a tavern after finding out that her and her family were going to be separated. And so this story kind of like persisted throughout much of the period as sort of without any really like identifying that individual with an actual person. And so in doing research at the National Archives, Dr. Thomas uncovered a petition filed on the behalf of Miss Ann Williams, um, who was in fact the same Anna who leapt from the window. And so what ultimately they discovered was that um, that Anna not only leapt from the window, but she survived. And not only did she survive, but she sued for her freedom and ultimately won her freedom in court. And so this is an incredible story about Anna's life that we were then, Grant and myself, were then positioned to, okay, this amazing film has been created. There's this amazing story to tell. How can we make this accessible for classroom students? How can we bring this to classrooms in ways that are really meaningful for students? And so kind of in an effort to mimic some of Dr. Thomas's own investigative work, Grant and I made the decision to frame the learning guide that we ultimately produced and that all of you that are participating or part of this presentation will have access to. We ultimately made the decision to frame that, the learning guide, around as an inquiry. And so to be clear, what we mean by that is we're talking about involving students directly in investigative acts. So looking at original material and working through that material in an effort to find new understandings through, again, mimicking the habits of mind or the habits of the professional historians and social scientists. And so, as I'm sure most of us know, though, thinking about engaging students in inquiry, students, we can't just sort of give them a file of primary sources and expect magical things to happen. But we know, and research would suggest, that students need to be appropriately scaffolded in that process. And so with that, we were led to think more deeply about ways of framing an inquiry. So we relied heavily on the C3 inquiry arc, and I don't know the extent to which participants here are familiar with that, but essentially it's a basically guided scaffolded process that begins with questions that interest students, so developing questions around things that interest students, and then having students work with the disciplinary tools and concepts within the disciplines and within those professional, whether it be historians or political scientists, et cetera. And then Dimension 3, working with evidence, and Dimension 4, which is the interesting and compelling piece of communicating conclusions and taking action. More recently, the National Council for the Social Studies, the C3 organization, has put together kind of a blueprint for what this looks like. And so that's really kind of provided us with a tool to put something together that could be appropriately scaffolded, but also acknowledging the sophistication and student-owned understanding of history as a discipline, but providing them with the type of support that they would need to navigate this difficult history, and looking specifically at Anna's life. And so with that, I don't know the extent to which our audience today is familiar with this. Again, we will provide you with the copy of our IDM at the conclusion of this presentation, but kind of stepping outside of Anna for just a moment and just kind of provide you with a sort of a bird's eye view as to how it works. Essentially, students work with a compelling question. So if we think about something such as, was the American Revolution really revolutionary? I mean, that really stands apart as a compelling question. And so to introduce students to that type of question, there's a staging the compelling question phase. And essentially, I like to think of this as an anticipatory set that engages students into the inquiry. For the Anna inquiry, there's this depiction that was produced during Anna's lifetime that depicted her leaping from the third-story window. So having students do a visual analysis of that was the starting point, or the kind of the entry point for that inquiry in particular, for our inquiry. And so, let's see here. Again, just to provide you with some information about how the IDM works, it goes to get to position students in order to be able to effectively answer that compelling question. Which frames the inquiry, students go through a series of performance tasks. So in the instance of, was the American Revolution really revolutionary, you can think that, a task that might equip students or build their understanding towards a question of that nature, having students, or a task such as having students write a paragraph from various perspectives as to whether or not the revolution was in fact really revolutionary. And so with that, students could look at, for example, letters from Abigail Adams to John Adams. One of the more compelling components of the IDM and C3 is this final summative piece where students not only address the compelling question which guides the inquiry, and the compelling question that we looked at for our inquiry, was what did freedom mean for Anna? And so there's a taking informed action piece where students actually do something with their learning at the conclusion of the inquiry. And so again, this is just sort of providing sort of what that looks like. But you can imagine students having gone through an inquiry, and then there's that final summative stage where they're then asked to do something with that. And so with our inquiry in particular, we were looking at, we focused on primarily on memorializing or remembering Anna. But time permitting, we would like to hear from you all with regards to, after we screen the film, which we are going to screen the film here in a moment, other ways of taking informed action that might encourage student agency and civic engagement with regards to Anna's story and maybe enslavement and difficult history more broadly. Grant, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you. And
Aaron, do you want me to give Grant access to the PowerPoint moving things forward?
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, so I'm going to switch it over to Grant. Grant, it should work just fine. Just kind of be patient when you click through things. Sometimes there's a bit of a lag.
Okay.
And the arrow keys on your keyboard should work too.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, so thinking about our project, using the film, really our focus here, as you can see, with this quote from LeGarrette King and Ashley Woodson, we saw this really as an opportunity to shift the way students engage with learning about American enslavement, which, as Aaron said at the top, right, often is focused on just the sort of political or economic dimensions. And we felt like the story of Anne Williams would allow students to really consider much more carefully the idea that sort of being enslaved or being free, that it was not just sort of a neat binary, but that enslavement influenced, right, different areas of people's lives and didn't actually completely strip them of their human agency. So our sort of three main goals as we created the IDM, first is trying to use digital storytelling as a way to scaffold for students a more sensitive and rigorous way to think about human beings and the decisions that they made in the past. Secondly, we really wanted to focus on the idea that, and Anna's story is a great example of this, right? The idea that human agency did not disappear just because someone was enslaved. And so to have students think about the ways that Anna, in her own decision-making, was able to maintain autonomy throughout her life, whether or not even before she achieved manumission. And then third, as Aaron also talked about, what we wanted to do using the IDM is have students engage with primary sources and digital storytelling. So we're going to watch the film in just a moment, but the third part of the inquiry, which we won't really get to see today, focuses almost entirely on a series of curated primary documents, and has students start to make their own assessments of Anne Williams' legal case. So as we watch the film, we're going to try to engage in a very, very abbreviated way in the same kind of thinking that that students would. And so as you're watching, what we'd like you to do is try to pick out 4 pivotal moments in Anna's life. And as you think about each of these moments, try to consider the degree to which Anna was able to act sort of with complete autonomy, and what forces may have constrained her in each of those moments. So we'll...
All right, so at this point, I'll try to get the film fired up. Okay. Aaron and Grant, can you guys see it on your side?
Yes.
All right. Just let me know if I need to adjust the sound once I get this started.
There's something to stories. Sometimes it's just facts. Sometimes there's a truth burning to be told in its own way. I was born on a plantation near Bladensburg, Maryland. Push this real hard. Bring it in because you're bringing it the real into here. See? Do it again. My mother Nan taught me 2 lessons: how to God save my mind and my spirit, and how a slave woman's craft to save her life.
Anna, no matter how you are treated, you keep the in here safe. What, Mom? The in here. No matter how tired, no matter how tired, weary, worn you get in this place, you keep the in here safe. And you tell it, I love you. Yes, tell it to her.
Mother showed me how to prepare the filaments from the flax stalk and then how to weave them into fine linen.
Make sure you lift.
I am a descendant of master weavers from the land of Igbo in the Benin country. I treasure my legacy. And so I hid away some of what I made to pass on to others for my children. The dray men picked up from me weekly the fine cloth I had woven. They took it to market. I could tell they liked my work. Some even nodded their satisfaction, especially one. I'm Edward, he told me. But my master named me Ned. I remembered Edward. I had seen the white masters offer their hands to the mistresses. Edward offered his hand to me. That one day, the house mistress came to the loom house and took my how-to-wear cloth. The labor on this plantation belongs to me, she declared. You shall hand over to me every piece right now. Now, Master Coleridge and house mistress saw themselves as respectable Southern planters. Massa boasted about how he treated his slaves. Edward lived on a nearby plantation owned by Massa McHugh. Late at night, Edward was allowed to come and be with me as long as he was back by morning. But he needed a pass. That pass. That paper. It had to be signed by McHugh. Massa Coleridge presumed like he was officiating. But we made the jump ourselves. We married. And here, he had nothing at all to do with that. But there came a year that brought a great change. Massa Coleridge, at last, his money was out. He drew buyers, but only one visitor came to my thoughts. It was Massa McHugh would be here. Massa Coleridge signed the papers. He sold me and my children to Massa McHugh. But he also secured a promise. He promised to keep us all together. I was closer to Edward, but the whole situation with Master McHugh was it was bad, just bad. My mind ran with worry. Master McHugh was loaning out Edward more and more, always off to Baltimore. And oftentimes he delivered all the way across the bay. Monday morning, it would loan out again and would not be home till morning. Tuesday morning, that morning, despair walked into the yard. A Georgia man came to purchase slaves. I hadn't put my arms around Edward since not a Sunday. I pleaded with Master McHugh to not sell us off from Edward, not to send the children from their father. Overseer ordered him deep down into the fields before daybreak. I couldn't see him. You promised me, Mother. Let me see my husband. He acted as if he didn't know who Edward was. I heard from rumor we was in Washington and holding till the new master came to take me to Georgia. Nightfall came quick. The white men from the tavern below were going from room to room, checking to see who was left.
Okay.
All right, I've got us back on the PowerPoint grant, so the control is still in your hands.
Great. So why don't we just take a moment and we can try the chat function again here to see sort of what did we identify in the film as kind of pivotal moments.
Okay, so attendees, once again, presenters would like your participation here. Elizabeth identified her marriage to George.
Yeah, certainly. And the period of courtship before the marriage too, right, would be certainly a pivotal moment. Are there any others that we saw there?
Jumping from the tavern window, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess we can take those two to start. So if we think about
In the moment, man came to buy slaves from her master.
yes, also, and I think there was also one that we might direct students towards, also very early on, learning a craft, learning weaving from her mother, right? So we might say each of those four moments were pivotal in the sense that they had great influence on Anna's life. But
Same
as we think,
with having a family. It's another
yes,
one.
and also having a family. So as we consider each of those, are there any moments that stand out in terms of Anna displaying greater or less autonomy?
That's again a question to the attendees. Which of those
So,
stands out as really kind of highlighting her autonomy or agency? So Elizabeth argues that learning a skill gives her autonomy and agency. One of our attendees pointing that out.
Yeah, which is an excellent point. And so as we think about that, right, even in the film, there's emphasis placed on Anna's skill, right, and its marketability, which her mistress, right, sort of tries to emphasize that the labor, right, actually doesn't belong to Anna. But what the film does, and hopefully what our inquiry will help students do, is complicate that notion a little bit, to sort of help them visualize and understand that the actual labor, right, and labor relations weren't necessarily so cut and dry. So I think in the interest of time, we're going to move forward.
And Elizabeth also points out that, suing for her freedom, which is, discussed there at the very end, is definitely another mark of agency.
Yes, and so the bulk actually of the inquiry and student work, I'm trying to move ahead in the slide here. Yeah, the bulk of student work actually with primary sources after viewing the film is really an inquiry into Anna's legal case, which happened roughly 15 years after her leap from the window. So the final piece of the inquiry asks students to essentially try to come up with plausible arguments that the jurors in her case may have used in order to grant her freedom, because even though her case is recorded, the deliberations are not. So this was obviously a very, very abbreviated version of the inquiry, but does anyone have questions or thoughts or reflections after seeing the film and sort of thinking about this kind of digital storytelling as a way to shift teaching about enslavement away from the sort of purely political or economic factors and towards considerations of one woman's life and decisions?
We'll give attendees here a minute or two to compose their thoughts. Elizabeth notes that I used this story in a related article with her social studies methods students, and they really got a lot out of it.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, that's excellent.
I guess one of the points I'd like to raise in kind of thinking about this is that I find that, really naming historical individuals has a certain power in its own. Oftentimes history is all about, the deeds of dead white guys. So being able to really personalize and name and identify a much wider array of historical actors, such as somebody like Ann Williams, I think is really powerful for students. It's that story part of history that always resonates with me. Elizabeth points out that, it was the empathy that you mentioned. They related more to this story than anything else we discussed. It's the same thing I see in my classroom, Elizabeth, at the college level too. It's what you gain when you personalize it.
Yeah, and I think too, with that personalization idea too, I think the idea of Ann Williams, if we think about early on in our presentation and how enslavement is typically taught. Some of the research would suggest that when it is taught, or the perspectives that are mentioned are those that we're kind of all familiar with, the canon, so to speak. And so I think personalization of it really comes through too, in the idea that, Ann Williams is not really, you're not going to go to any textbook, for example, in any classroom and find Ann Williams recorded, this moment and these pivotal moments that we've been talking about. You're not going to find them in any of the textbooks. So I think that too kind of resonates with middle and high school students in ways that are really meaningful and transformative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of worth noting that with a story like this, it's not without complexity, and that this too, right, through the story of this individual woman, students are able to encounter difficult historical questions in ways that I think often, if it's just the kind of standard narrative of Frederick Douglass or the sort of, the famous historical actor, I think it's both for students and teachers can be a little bit more difficult to really dig in and think in sort of more complicated ways about why people acted in certain or made certain choices in a given moment, which is one of the things that we hope our inquiry accomplishes or will help students accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So Aaron and Grant, we're down to about the last 2 minutes. If you could take us through the last couple of slides you have there, which I know have some references and resources for people.
Yes. Okay, so the resources, obviously, we have the film that we just watched, and then all of these links. One is to the complete IDM, the inquiry document. The other is to the PDF of a sort of companion article that Aaron and I wrote in Social Education just this past year. And then the film's website, which has additional resources for teachers and students, and curated primary source documents that describe Ann Williams' life and her legal case as well.
And then for the attendees, we also added we added Aaron's email contact there. I am under the understanding that the PowerPoint will be available for attendees of the conference. This entire session has been recorded. But if for some reason you're having a hard time finding the actual PowerPoint or any of these resources, please shoot Aaron an email and he'd be happy to point you in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Well, those are just our references within the presentation itself.
Great. And then the last reminder to everyone in the session is we've got that door prize thing for the survey if you fill it out. Elizabeth followed up here at the end. This was a great piece. Thank you for sharing. So Aaron and Grant, thank you so much. At this point, in the interest of time, we should probably wrap things up.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone for your active participation. And as Josh mentioned, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and we will be more than happy to share and get back with you and continue the dialogue if need be. But thank you again to everyone.
Yes, thanks very much.
Thank you guys both. And thank you for the attendees for participating too. All right, enjoy the rest of the conference and wash your damn hands. All right, Aaron and Grant, I think we're done. You guys still there?
Yes.
All right. So I think we've quit broadcasting. I can see the attendees cycling out. Yeah, thank you so much. I think this went well. I hope that the attendees got something out of this too.
Yeah, thank you very much for your help. That was a little unorthodox, I guess, but
Not a problem. All right. Well, good luck with everything and enjoy the rest of the conference. Hope you get a chance to dip into one or two other sessions.
great. Thanks very much.
All right. Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.